Hi, everyone. Glad to see you here and glad that we have a nice sized group. Some of you have already heard me comment about this. Most of you have been to a number of conferences, on-site conferences over the years. And on the last day, what do you see? You see suitcases lined up against the wall in the meeting room. And you have some people who are saying, no, I'm really sorry to miss the last session. I've got to catch an airplane. Well, on this conference, we're not catching airplanes. So in some ways, that's nice. And actually, it's nice to see so many of you here. So thank you for coming. As you all know, this focus is going to talk about how do we think about transforming ourselves and our institutions for the future. How does change align with and honor the commitments that individuals and institutions have previously made? Change often seems both essential and it also seems daunting. We invite our set of speakers in this session to discuss how their projects are working toward intentional change. Change brought about by the pandemic, by racial equities and justice, and our other factors that are facing their communities and institutions. So that's just a brief introduction to the topic, and I'm going to turn it over to the two project teams and let them introduce themselves. Sarah, why don't you go first?
Great. Thank you, Sandy. Thanks for being here, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be able to have a little time to talk with folks at the awardee meeting. So my name is Sarah Garlick. I work for a nonprofit support organization for the Hubbard Brook Ecosystem Study, which is a long-term ecological research program located in an experimental forest in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. And I'm here with my colleague, Peter Groffman, who will speak next, who's an ecologist and one of the leaders of the Hubbard Brook Ecosystem Study. And we wanted to spend a few minutes today considering kind of the broader STEM research enterprise in the United States and the roles of the science learning and science communication fields. And specifically, I want to consider the idea of public engagement with science as is researched and practiced and problematized and advanced by many of the people who've been here at the awardee meeting as a transformative force on STEM research. So as I said, we work in the context of ecology and the environmental sciences. And the question driving much of my work is, what if the development of intentional, ongoing, reciprocal relationships with local community members, with stakeholder groups, and with decision makers was an integral part of the scientific research process, if it was embedded into the cultures and the practices of STEM research institutions? So how might that advance not only community learning about current scientific research, but also scientists learning about communities? And ultimately, over time, how might that impact the research questions that are being asked and the ways that research findings are shared and being used across different sectors of our society? So we're thinking about, as a lever of change, how to shift kind of the traditional outreach and education modes of STEM research institutions to a mode of more intentional relationship building and multi-directional communication. And we've spent the past 7 years or so developing some of these intentional openings or societal connections at Hubbard Brook. First, with an Azle Pathways project that enabled a series of facilitated dialogues with scientists and members of multiple communities to define what I think of as kind of our engagement space. So really working together in dialogue to map out where's the overlap between what it is the scientists study at this experimental forest and what are the topics, the socio-scientific issues that community members care about. And then more recently with a design and development project to create intentional institutional mechanisms that allow scientists to work, to listen to community members, to work with community members in co-design and co-production of knowledge, and then to reach beyond our known actors, our known networks, and kind of reach out of our own echo chambers. And when I reflect on this work, much of it has been, I come at this from a practitioner perspective. A lot of it has been about the how and the what, like what are the protocols for facilitating productive, inclusive dialogue where mutual learning can take place? And what are the methods for brokering relationships that are reciprocal, that are meaningful, and that can last beyond a grant cycle? And when I didn't account for in my thinking, especially kind of early on about this lever of institutional change is the who. So specifically, the role of public engagement practitioners who are working within STEM research institutions, the practitioners who are positioned to foster and create and lead these meaningful societal connections, and to do so with all the wisdom and humility and the reflexivity that I think has really been on display the last 3 days of this awardee meeting. And so I want to hand it over to Peter, but I just want to leave with this idea that to realize the transformation of the scientific research enterprise that I think many of us envision, that there is a missing workforce, and we need to think beyond training scientists in the skills of science communication and think about how we are supporting the people, the knowledge brokers, the boundary spanners, the science communication professionals who can be positioned, not just as helpers in some removed university office, but who are at the leadership table with the scientists, with the leaders of research centers, so that high quality and evidence-informed engagement is not an add-on, but really a core practice of scientific research. And I think that this community here, brought together by the AZLE program, really is the place to start thinking about innovative ways to address this missing workforce. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Peter.
So my perspective as I come to this is I'm a research scientist. I'm a ecosystem ecologist, a terrestrial biogeochemist with an interest in carbon and nitrogen cycling. And I've been working at the Hubbard Brook Long-Term Ecological Research Site since 1992. So I come to this very much from the science data collection side. And it has been transformational for me to participate in the AZLE funded project that Sarah has been leading for a couple of reasons. For one thing, it's caused us to be more deliberate and thoughtful in our activities. So now we're spending time thinking about, well, what? I guess I should back up a little bit. My perspective is I'm definitely a research scientist, but I have a real interest in and concern about science communication. I think that scientists, that's just a real challenge. I don't think we do it all that well, and it's a very important topic, and I'm very excited to work to learn about it and improve it. And I think the participation in the AZLE project has been transformational for us. And many of these reasons seem kind of obvious, but they're just not done, and so they've been very helpful. So it's caused us to be much more deliberate and thoughtful in our activities as scientists. What are we trying to communicate? Who are we trying to communicate with? How do we want to be perceived in our communication, and how can we be more effective? And so it's caused us to grapple with those ideas, and then the realization we do it much better when we work with professionals. And again, that's not a it's not a super deep insight, but we now, once we get to work with professionals in informal science learning, we get feedback on our messages, we get feedback on our messaging, we have a stronger sense of what works and what doesn't. Again, simple lessons, but very important. And a big part of that is preparation helps. Again, this is another thing that's kind of obvious, but Sarah's led these roundtables where we have roundtables with stakeholders, and I do a lot of work on winter climate change. And so we've assembled these roundtables where we've got a bunch of stakeholders that are affected by winter climate change. So this is farmers, maple sugar producers, loggers, town supervisors, ski area operators, snowmobiling groups, cross-country ski groups. They're all affected by winter climate change. And when we set up these roundtables, are they particularly going to be comfortable talking to each other? And are they going to be comfortable talking to scientists? Probably not. But in the roundtables that we've done, there's been a tremendous amount of preparation done in advance, where there's a lot of outreach to the stakeholders, there's discussion with the stakeholders, so that when they come to the roundtable, they feel valued, they feel prepared, they feel that people really want to hear from them. And as a result, these roundtables have been super lively. And I've learned a ton. I mean, we've learned a ton about what people perceive, what they value, how their perceptions and values influence their actions. And it has been transformational, both in the way we frame our science and then also in the way we interact with stakeholders. And again, it's not rocket science, but preparation really helps. And then going forward, I think the things that we've learned have left us really well poised to address diversity, equity, and inclusion issues at our site. We have a great interest in engaging with Indigenous communities in the region and with urban communities that are more ethnically diverse. than we've been engaging with. And now we know how to make people feel comfortable. We know how to make people feel valued. And I think that the experiences that we've got and where we've learned how to think about be deliberate, more thoughtful in our activities, to focus on our messages and our messaging, and then most impressively, to make people feel comfortable and valued in our sessions, is we're poised to go forward to engage with more diverse audiences. So that's all for me.
Okay, very good. Okay, and our next project is headed up by Teresa. So I'll let you introduce yourself and your partner.
Thank you so much. And Sarah, just certainly some overlap. I'm already thinking about questions we're asking too about who was at the table from the get-go. We've thought that out. We didn't, and going back and rethinking some of these as we're thinking about change and positive change. So I'm Teresa Cavazos-Cohn. I'm a research associate professor at the University of Idaho, and I am here with my project partner, Amanda Grant, from Ponderosa State Park. I'm going to be a little bit more formal in my presentation here, 8 minutes. I wanted to be careful, so I'm going to be scripted. And then I also want to leave some time for Amanda to talk about our particular partnership. And I'm going to go ahead and share some slides here too. So this is a pilot and feasibility study called Stories of Fire, Integrative Informal Learning Through Participatory Narratives. And the Stories of Fire project, and giving you the briefest of summaries, couples people's stories about fire with fire science to facilitate better dialogues about how we'll live with increasing fire in the Western United States. And we're focused on interpretive programming, so think of ranger programs at state parks or national parks. And we're really focused on rural audiences, but also a diversity of rural audiences, right? And complicating what we think of as rural. So around here, this also includes Indigenous and Latino communities. Since this is a session specifically focused on working towards change and transformation in ourselves, our institutions, and our fields, I thought I'd focus on 3 different kinds of transformation in each category and how we're grappling with these in Stories of Fire. So first of all, and most directly, as you can see, in the image, this is actually an image of one of our interviewees took from her horse. And this is the year of the fire that burnt her ranch, and then the year after, right, of the fire read that's coming. This is just this last year, the second picture. So fire is an element of transformation, a destructive and regenerative force of our landscape and our communities that's increasing in extent and severity in a large portion of the Western United States. Fire suppression practices of the last century, plus climate change and introduced plants such as cheatgrass, have transformed and continue to transform patterns of fire. And we've been having like an internal fight about whether we can use the word regime and fire regimes or not with our humanities portion of the team. I can talk about that in a second. So we're saying patterns of fire. And we must come to terms with living with more fire, prescribed and or wild, which is a big ask for people who have lost homes or been evacuated or are living with asthma. And we know that there are environmental justice issues embedded in patterns of fire, like who suffers the impacts of wildfire most severely and struggles with recovery, as well as who fire suppression policies were created by and who they served. So storytelling, like fire, is also transformative and also potentially destructive and regenerative, as we see in national dialogues right now concerning some of the most critical science issues of our time. Perhaps for this reason, storytelling or narrative is receiving increasing attention in science communication for things like better recall and retention, situated knowledge, and what our project is really most interested in, the ways in which stories allow people to bring themselves and their identities to science spaces, and the ways that stories transform science spaces themselves. So we now are at the end of year 1, and we are recognizing how complex and textured this work is, both in terms of patterns of fire on landscapes, fire regimes, and people's nuanced relationships with fire across Idaho. We thought about this up front, but not nearly in the complexity that we know now that we need to think about this. Each place has its own dynamic fire patterns and its own dynamic people, and so each program we're working with is unique. Few examples here. These are regional, so not specifically in Idaho. Could burning, so some indigenous burning in the upper right, agricultural burning, really common on the Palouse Prairie, and then 2 examples of wildfire on the left. Again, those 2 pictures are taken by an interviewee. So we are working on the premise that everyone has a story about fire in the Western US, even if that story is breathing in smoke, and that there's science in these stories. So we're really interested in drawing on these stories to co-create knowledge in informal STEM settings, such as interpretive programs in state parks. So moving on to a second element of transformation in this project, fire communication has been central to national suppression efforts. And as we consider new forms of fire communication, we're concerned not just with the content of communication, but its structure, like so many others have addressed in this conference, right? Such as who holds epistemological supremacy and at what consequence. We are specifically trying to transform spaces like this one. This is sort of like the deficit model of communication, I think, on the left structurally, right, where you've got the old slide projector. And when I took this picture, I'm standing next to the old slide projector box that's no longer there, right? So we're trying to work with this and transforming it into a storytelling space. So in this picture on the right, this is a graduate student, Jenny Wolf, who's facilitating a Stories of Fire program. Designed to both share what we know from academic fire scientists and facilitate storytelling spaces in which audiences can share their stories. And for those of you who may be familiar with ACE models or audience-centered approaches here from the national parks, we're adapting that model to create some of these programs. And then jumping now to a third element of transformation, when we're thinking about institutions, we're working to transform STEM teams. At the University of Idaho, half of our team is from the English department and half from the College of Natural Resources. And as you see on the left, Aaron James is an eco-narratologist, which honestly, I didn't even know was a thing until right before this project, like you could be. Jennifer Ladino studies affect and emotion. Again, both of them are from the English department. Lita Kobziar is in the center. She's a fire ecologist, and I'm a geographer and science communicator. And then our graduate students have a kind of interdisciplinary space. And they're both from the English department and environmental sciences. And a lot of the interdisciplinary hashing out really honestly happens with the graduate students in that space, and then they bring it to the team. We've worked really hard not to make the humanities the delivery tool of the sciences, but to co-create with the humanities, right? The traditional domain of storytelling. And that's been really exciting and expansive. I think most importantly, for our fire ecologist has developed some really neat relationships and innovative thinking. We're also collaborating with rural parks and environmental education centers across Idaho. You can see in the right there, in 5 different ecosystems, all with dramatically different patterns of fire. And then to offer an example of this, I'm going to pass off now to Amanda Grant, and she's going to talk specifically about the collaboration we have going on here, which is with McCall Outdoor Science School graduate students who are working on developing and delivering interpretive programs with Ponderosa State Park. So Amanda, I'll turn over to you.
All right, so yeah, again, I'm Amanda. I'm the interpretive park ranger here at Ponderosa State Park in McCall. And so over the past winter of 2021, Ponderosa State Park had a selective thinning project to reduce forest density and remove hazardous fuels on 90 acres of the park. And this was done to reduce the potential for high intensity fires. This improved conditions for native Ponderosa pines, which are the namesake of our park, as well as our Douglas fir and our Western large trees. And we removed the overstocked, less fire resistant grand fir trees. These grand fir trees had come in because of years of suppression of the regular low intensity fires. So the park's signature Ponderosa pine tree with thick bark and high branches is adapted to withstand low intensity fires, but fire suppression over the past 100 to 130 years in the region and in the West in general has altered the natural balance of the forest and has allowed the grand fir to move in. So after our thinning was completed, the excess slash was piled and it will be burned late this fall. And low intensity prescribed burns will be conducted this upcoming spring of 2022 to complete the restoration project and promote the regeneration of Ponderosa pines. We're also currently conducting road edge maintenance and creating fuel breaks to improve public safety. The first slide, we showed a picture of our end goal, which was the healthy, well-spaced, mature Ponderosa pine forest. And that was an area where we had done a thinning project back in the early 90s. And so that's our end goal for this project. But communicating this project to the general public has been a large challenge for the park because thinning projects in civil terms look messy during and after their initial completion, as you can see in this photo right here. So these are pictures of our slash piles that are going to be burned late this fall. Also, justifying the introduction of fire to a landscape or the cutting of a tree can be a challenging task. And reminding the public that we're working to restore the natural balance in the forest, and that fire was a frequent, necessary, and natural part of the Ponderosa pine forest is really important. On average, Ponderosa pine forests burn in a natural cycle every 7 years. So if we don't properly manage our natural resources, we're putting the health of the park and public safety at risk. So when the University of Idaho's McCall Outdoor Science School stepped in and wanted to collaborate on presentations in the park, it really helped the park communicate this message to the park visitors and took a large burden off of the park and the park staff. So the McCall Outdoor Science School graduate students came to present once a month this summer at our evening interpretive programs to work with audiences on creating dialogues about the importance of fire on the landscape and the role fire plays in our Ponderosa pine ecosystem. So it's extremely helpful for us to have McCall Outdoor Science School putting on these in-person interactive presentations on fire ecology with the public that help to educate and engage the public, and it directly applied to our restoration project that we have in the park.
Thanks, Amanda. And I would say one of the things that I learned in this partnership with Amanda and other places too, but particularly here, is Amanda's the sole interpreter. And the amount that she has on her plate is unbelievable, right? And so we have ready graduate students who are looking for projects. And so working with Amanda worked quite well, I think, for both fulfilling needs of the park and the needs of our graduate students in fulfilling their training. And I also think that, I forgot what I was going to say. I had a thought that I lost. I'll just bypass that. I'll come back to it. But I want to show in this particular picture, Amanda, I think, is on the lower right, yes, of this image. And this is a lesson in which our graduate students have spent a lot of time with Amanda, learning about what the park's doing, trying to understand the fire regimes of the forest, talking with our fire ecologist. She goes through every program that the students present to make sure that it's representing correct fire ecology from her perspective of this area. And then the graduate students develop the whole Arc of Dialogue ACE method, and then also incorporate visitors' experiences of fire in their own lives into the programs. Interestingly, in all the programs that we put on this summer, 5 different places, a number of different programs, I can only remember one program, there may have been 2, in which someone didn't talk about an evacuation or a house fire. So people are coming into these spaces, these kind of traditional science spaces, with a lot of emotional connections with fire and experiences that are impacting the way that they are processing information and understanding fire in their lives and in their ecosystems. And we learned a lot just about the kinds of stories that people are carrying around in all of the different places that we work. So just as a final slide here, there are many kinds of transformation in stories of fire. The force of fire itself, methods of communication, and humanities, sciences, interdisciplinary collaborations. But at the center of all our work is shared story. At its core, Stories of Fire attempts to understand the fire science evident in lived experience and to figure out how to best facilitate storytelling spaces in ways that are as diverse as our communities and as diverse as our fires. Thanks.
Thank you, Teresa.
Oh, I better stop sharing here.
Thank you. Thank you, Teresa and Amanda, and to Sarah and Peter. I'm going to turn it now over to Sandy for any reflections, observations that you have.
Well, I think these are these 2 projects are both good examples of the kinds of change that is taking place. As you heard from Sarah and Peter, they've been working with their project now for a number of years. And I was particularly struck by hearing Peter say how this project has really helped him better understand and embrace the idea of communities that are very diverse, and how, as a researcher, you what are the strategies for really bringing people together and making them feel included in the work that's being done. I mean, that's a great testimonial to from a researcher about this. And certainly listening, Teresa's project, Teresa and Amanda are still fairly early on in their project. But again, the lessons they are learning, the changes they are starting to see, I think are really exciting. Now, we've got approximately 25 of you who are in this session, and you all are engaged in your own projects, and you have your own experience, both the successes you are starting to have as you see changes being made, but also, I'm sure, the challenges. And as we all know, change sometimes can be rapid. I mean, the pandemic, for example, has resulted in really quick changes in the way we work, we get our work done. Other changes are really slow. They're very incremental. And I know at times it can be rather frustrating that we, in terms of when are we ever going to see the kind of change that we had envisioned when we started a project. But again, we have a great group of people here, and you're going to be given the opportunity now to share many of your stories, ask your questions of each other, make connections through the breakout room. So I'll let Jamie explain how that's going to work.
Thanks, Sandy. Agreed. Lots of richness in both projects, and I know a lot in this room as well.